here, and I look forward to walking through this and then having some conversation about it. So the current facts for test optional. About 1,570 schools are now test optional, and that's 2/3 of legitimate bachelor degree granting institutions. Included among them, 800 or so ranked in the top tiers of US News and World Report. And you know that there's a pretty significant hierarchy. So there are many tiers, and there are many colleges in there. 59 schools are currently test blind, and we'll get to what that means in a moment. And the notable exceptions at this point are the University of Florida system and the military academies. And this is all from Fairtest's website, and I found that website to have really the most comprehensive list and updated details on everything test optional, and also from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. So just rolling on here. But what is test optional? Broadly speaking, first of all, test optional is probably here to stay. And that's, I think, a good thing. But ultimately, what test optional says is that colleges will allow some or all students to not submit SAT or ACT scores if they choose not to. So you could have situations where some students are submitting scores and some students are not submitting scores. And you can have sort of variations on that theme. And this is taken from the College Board's website. It doesn't mean that the schools are not interested in seeing applicants' performance and potential, but if a student doesn't submit their scores, it won't be considered in the application review, which sounds great. The only problem with that is that what it doesn't say is, could you somehow be disadvantaged if you don't submit a score? And that is sort of an open issue. It's unclear at this point, and that's really the purpose of this presentation. Understanding the test optional policies, I think, is important, and it's nuanced, and really the best advice, and this is where I summarize things at the end, the best advice is that you need to direct students to the individual college admissions pages, because there is such a nuanced approach to test optional right now. So let's talk about this nuance. So test optional a little less broadly. So there's test flexible admissions. And test flexible means, hey, you don't have to submit the SAT or the ACT, we'll take some other tests instead. And typical tests that sort of fall on this list include AP or SAT subject tests. And then there's test blind. Test blind is, it's my favorite because it's the clearest. It's basically, it doesn't matter if you submit a score, we're not going to look at it. And so it's clear, it's definitive, everybody can understand it, and everyone's on the same page. But unfortunately, right now, about less than 2% of colleges and universities are using test blind. And none of the colleges or universities on this list are necessarily in the competitive group. So, so its use could be beneficial in the future, but not so much right now. And then there's test optional, and test optional has many different permutations, and that's what we need to look at. So test optional examples, in some cases, you won't need to submit an SAT or an ACT if your GPA or your class rank meets a certain threshold, which is terrific and pretty straightforward. There are exceptions to that, and that includes homeschooling and international student applications. So generally speaking, all international students at this point still have to submit SAT or ACT scores. In some cases, colleges allow students to decide for themselves whether to submit scores. And that's, I think, what what I was referring to a little earlier. Yeah, you can decide to submit it or not. and then the problem there is you don't know, if they're looking at others that are submitting SAT scores, you don't know if you're necessarily advantaged or disadvantaged by that. And then some colleges that are test optional require the scores for other uses. And this is the big one. So merit aid and state aid, merit aid and institutional aid at various levels are all awarded based on a series of criteria. And among the criteria, and actually sort of foremost in the past among the criteria, was SAT or ACT scores. And so this is where we don't have clarity. So I know NACAC has endeavored on this terrific sort of sign up to be test optional and mean test optional, meaning like you as an institution agree not to treat anyone differently whether they submit scores or not. And I think that's terrific. It's a statement of affirmation. It's good, and it's I think a start, but it's not universal. I think about 500 schools are on there right now. So it's still like, it's a good idea, but it's not quite there. It's not universal. And so those are basically sort of the three, deeper looks at test optional examples. And that third one is really where we're going to jump off here in a second, because that means that there's merit aid on the table that students might otherwise not qualify for. So what does that look like? Well, about $32 billion is awarded each year in the form of merit aid. Merit aid is essentially, it's not financial aid that needs to be paid back. It's not a loan. It's not a grant. It could be, I guess it could be a grant. But it's in the form of scholarships. And the scholarships come in some of these typical forms that I think a lot of people on this call are familiar with, and that's the National Merit Scholarship, the National Achievement Scholarship, which is sort of, that would be under the National Merit Scholarship. It's more focused on marginalized populations, which is great because the National Merit Scholarship is, straight test score. And then there are guaranteed scholarships, which come from the schools themselves. And those, if you have any kids in college, and I had to go through, those can be significant. So SAT or ACT threshold scores can trigger some good institutional money. And so at this point, as I said, PSAT, SAT, and ACT scores are still being used in some places, and probably in more places than not, to determine merit awards. And that's where the problem is, because that creates this inequity for students. And I think this inequity it's at least I can't see how it necessarily favors one social class over the other, or one ethnicity over the other. It just seems like we're not quite to the point where we can say that test optional won't disadvantage some group of students somewhere. And really, I'm apolitical on that otherwise. I want every student to have every opportunity to do the best that they can and earn the most money for college that they can. So this is the crux of the issue. And so NACAC is trying. They're trying to get everybody on board with this statement of affirmation. But at the same time, this recent task force information that they put out suggested that there's just a lot of variability, and allocation of financial aid, scholarships, yields and returns, and are still all tied to student test scores, or could be tied to student test scores. And so, that's, I think, as far as I understand it, the objective reality of the situation. So conclusions. So the main conclusion is, like, as well, I think, intended as test optional is, there's not a uniform way to apply it at this point. And because of that, there will be a certain group of students disadvantaged, or groups of students disadvantaged, by not taking it, at least in the next year or two. until everybody sort of comes together and gets, on the same page with how it will be applied. So if SAT and ACT scores are still being, or PSAT, SAT and ACT scores are still being used to determine financial aid awards, and if a test score can help a student improve their candidate profile, they should probably still take the PSAT, SAT, or ACT. And if the College Board's recent data on the number of test takers from 2020 is any indication, they kind of know that. It seems like that's sort of evident out there. So